Che Guevara has become an icon of a generation of youth fighting. Of youth fighting against what they perceive as the status quo. His face is on billboards, jewelry, and t-shirts. And even those who do not know the history of Che can confidently claim that Che was for the people. His death is shrouded by scandal, his life marred by hardships that are not fathomable by the general population. He was and is perceived a demon to some, and to others he is a face of an ideology. Through all the turmoil, Che considered and proved himself a guerrilla revolutionary soldier. Che described being a guerrilla as the highest stage of humankind, someone who is prepared to sacrifice himself for ideals, in this case the ideals of Marxist-Leninism. The solution that he called the solution to mankind's ills. The only way to turn around the world from what he called, dominated by what he called Yankee capitalism. Che is born Ernesto Guevara de la Serna on May 14th, 1928. His father, Ernesto Guevara Lynch, in the city of Rosario, Argentina. He was born in an upper middle class family and the oldest of his 4 siblings. It is noted by his younger friends that he played with all the neighborhood children, his neighbors and their servants' children as well, showing that he was both empathetic and attuned to equality, even in these younger stages of his life. Unfortunately, he suffered from asthma from a young age, and it lingered throughout his life, prompting his family to move to the dry town of Altagracia in hopes of limiting his symptoms. Their childhood friends remember that he had very distinctive traits. For one, he was a terrible dancer with no ear for music. Another, and probably the most stark, is that he had a horrible hygiene habit, often wearing 1 shirt a week, which he called the weekly shirt. The last is he was described as a womanizer, to a point that many historians now label him a hypersexual, seducing women regardless of age, shape, or appearance. Despite his unusual antics, Ernesto was a very inquisitive and bright child, reading often well above his peers' level. Authors such as Nehru, Gandhi, Mussolini, and Steinbeck. Ernesto enrolls in medical school, but before he finishes, he sets off on a South American tour with his friend Alberto Grinaldo on an old motorbike. There, they travel down south through Patagonia and off into Chile, where their bike breaks down and they're forced to essentially hitchhike, walk, etc., and decide to visit what it was at that time the world's largest open pit copper mine called Chiquicamata, which at that time held a certain stigma for Latin Americans as a monstrous beacon of American capitalism, exploiting the labor force. Companies such as Kinka and Anaconda, which of course were there for cheap labor and cheap materials. Seeing this, Ernesto is appalled at the conditions that the workers are in, and really gets his first taste of poverty coming from such a privileged upbringing. This was, for all intents and purposes, attuned Che to the suffering of his people. From Chile, Alberto and Ernesto continue north through Peru and Colombia and on into Venezuela, where Alberto decides to stay and Ernesto promptly returns home to finish medical school, but now with a social conscience. After graduating school, Ernesto goes to Bolivia, where he begins to meet other young idealists, many of whom are students who invite Ernesto to see Guatemala, which at that time, under President Arbenz, was attempting to enact basically social land reform from the unused land of the United Fruit Companies. Unfortunately, the United Fruit Companies leadership had very close ties with the Eisenhower administration, both through deals and through actual familial ties. The high-ranking members of the CIA and one of the corporate leaders of the United Fruit Company were brothers, and as such, the United Fruit Company was able to persuade the U.S. to be worked up into a fervor about communism spreading to the poor, small country of Guatemala. This charged atmosphere, under American pressure, was how Ernesto first sets foot in Guatemala, and thus strengthening his ideals on American capitalism and imperialism. It is here in Guatemala that Ernesto meets a woman that will become his first wife, Hilda Gildea. And it is Hilda that introduces Ernesto to the followers of a 26-year-old lawyer named Fidel Castro. At this point, Castro was known as in revolutionary circles for leading an attack on the Moncada barracks, which at that time was the second largest barracks in Cuba, in an attempt to overthrow the current president, Fulgencio Batista, along with other students and organized workers. By 1954, the political unrest in Guatemala, because of the political unrest in Guatemala, the U.S. pressured President Arbenz to step down, which he did, and Castillo Armez is placed in power. Though seen as many as an American puppet, which he is, he begins quickly to hunt down communists and members of the old regime. Quickly, Che finds himself as a target for either arrest or execution, and wisely leaves the country. He does so, bringing two things with him: a newfound contempt for America and his Marxist ideals, which he learned from the followers of Fidel Castro, many of whom were Marxist students. One commentator puts it very well when he says, Ernesto Guevara leaves Guatemala a very radicalized individual looking for a revolution to fight in. From Guatemala, Ernesto, following the example of many other leftists, head to Mexico City, where the president, Cardenas, had nationalized the oil fields 24 years prior. Here he meets up with the followers of Fidel, and finally meets Raul Castro, who Ernesto quickly befriends on Marxist platforms. Raul, at this point, was already a Marxist. Fidel is not. And Fidel is also still in prison for the attack on the Moncada military base. Ernesto looks to Raul as an inspiration, someone who, despite the odds, has launched a dictatorship-toppling attack on a military base, had served 22 months in a prison for it, and was now back in Mexico trying to build an army to try again. The brashness really spoke to Ernesto's character, and I think it's what really drew him to the movement. After 2 years and a lot of pressure from the Cuban people, Batista finally releases Fidel, and who quickly heads to Mexico to presumably regain control of his forces in Mexico. It is in 1955 that Ernesto and Fidel finally meet in an all-night meeting. After this meeting, they realize they share many of the same goals and certainly some of the common enemies. In the United States and in imperialism. Ernesto was quickly invited to join the July 26 movement, which is named after the date that Fidel and the men attacked the barracks. And he signs on as a troop doctor. This is his first case of receiving the nickname Che. Che, an informal Argentinian greeting, essentially meaning "Hey you." As the only non-Cuban and as an Argentinian, the nickname suits him well. Hilde, whom, if you remember, first introduced Che to the members of the July 26 movement, had remained in Guatemala because she had not been a political target, and now heads to Mexico to meet and be with Che with a small surprise. She was pregnant at this time. Che made the choice to do the right thing and married Hilde after she got there. But the birth of his daughter put his revolutionary ideas on hold, but after the birth of his daughter Hildita, Che puts all of his efforts into the movement in a preparation for an attack on Cuban soil. He and the members of the July 26 movement retreat to a large ranch on the outskirts of Mexico City, where they begin to train both with firearms and in survival tactics. Quickly, Che proves that he is one of the best shots in the camp and gains a small reputation for being a good soldier. Unfortunately, at some point, the fact that they're training gets out to the Mexican government, and they are all arrested, including Fidel, Che, and many other members of the July 26 movement. They are held for only a month, and as soon as they're released, they take their movement underground. At this point, Fidel buys a boat that he aptly names the Grandma, and Che writes his final goodbyes to his mother, wife, and daughter with the request that Hilde deliver them upon his death. November 25th, 1955, 82 men board the Grandma, and Che writes in his journal, by 1956, we shall be free or we shall be martyrs. The voyage of the July 26 movement is disastrous at best. Immediately they lose their bearings. A man falls overboard, though he is eventually saved. And they arrive in Cuba 2 days late, in the middle of the day, and in the wrong part of the country. Upon attempting to land, they hit a sandbar and are forced to wade ashore and then stumble into a swamp. where unfortunately they are quickly attacked by Batista's air forces and scattered. The next 3 days are full of attempting to regroup and avoiding the enemy. Unfortunately, on the third day, an ambush finds them and attacks. Che is wounded in the neck and forced to lighten his load. He is carrying two things at this time, a med kit and his rifle and ammunition. It is noted as by someone in their journal later that it was hardly a decision and happened instantaneously that Che dropped the med kit, grabbed his rifle, and ran into the woods. When Che finally regroups with the main group, he finds that only 17 of their original 82 remain, an enormous blow to the revolution. In fact, the group was so small that attacks originally reported that Fidel and Che had both been killed. Unbeknownst to most people, however, the small group continues along the southern shore into the Sierra Maestra Mountains, where Fidel has decided that will be the base of operations for the guerrilla warfare. The Sierra Maestra has a large peasant population, which the movement uses to their advantage. They ask for food, which they receive in most cases, although this was likely due to the fact that it was a bunch of bearded, smelly men with guns wanting food, rather than class solidarity. Fidel begins to attempt to recruit the peasants, and does so by stealing or liberating cows from local landowners and giving them to the peasants, of course a very popular move. The first offensive military action Fidel launches is to attack a local military base. This will be Che's first real military battle. On January 22nd, 1957, the group ambushes a military patrol, and Che finds himself face to face with the enemy. There is a moment in which he sees a soldier in front of him. He fires and the man falls. He is forced to stop for a moment to figure out how he feels about the situation. He wrote later that he felt fine. A time after the battle, it is discovered that one of the original July 26 movement, one Timio Guevara, is a spy, and Fidel has sentenced him to death. It is, as Che wrote in his journal later, it was him that was to execute Timmy himself. He describes the event in vivid detail, first binding the man, taking his items, talking to him for a moment, putting a revolver to his head, and firing. Che afterwards examines both the entry and exit wound, very much the doctor that he had been trained to be, even in instances over his ex-comrade, writing down later that he had slept fine with what he had done, and that times like these you could not tolerate even the suspicion of treason. During the entire two-year campaign, it is expected that Che executed at least dozens of traitors, a grim look onto his future role in the Cuban government. The movement continued to sweep through the Sierra Maestra Mountains, and at one point newspaper articles were published stating that the mighty rebel uprising, led by Fidel and Che, numbered in the 100 to 150 range. Apart from being a gross overestimation of the rebels' roughly 20 numbers, it also brought to light that Che and Fidel had in fact survived the third-day ambush. This prompted Batista to send 1,500 soldiers to hunt down the rebels. Unfortunately, at this point, Batista's soldiers, using information they gathered around the country, began targeting peasants as rebel sympathizers, resulting in several occasions of surrounding houses and firing into them. Unfortunately for them, rounding up peasants and shooting them, because at one point they had been afraid of being shot by bearded men wanting food, is not a very popular action to take amongst peasants, and thus the rebellion grew by the peasants who had lost family members. At the same time, recruiters began appearing in began appearing in cities, and the new recruits were often introduced to Che very first. As the doctor, he of course had to treat a lot of the health concerns that occurred throughout the very trying journey through very harsh conditions, treating everything from infected mosquito bites to exhaustion and dysentery. He became known as the tooth puller among the rebel soldiers for his rough treatment of patients and the pain that he inflicted during his treatments. Along with his doctor's duties, Che was known as an outstanding soldier, often leading at the front lines, while Fidel would often find a place to hide himself. Che would lead the troops, earning him a very respectable relationship with the recruits of the movement. Another commentator put it very well when he said that Che's, willingness to confront death, to take life to risk his own life, came together to form a charisma that is highly unusual, and which gave him an almost legendary reputation as he emerged as a man with some which some feared and others admired. Seeing his ability in battle, Fidel promotes Che to commandant and puts him in charge of 75 men that are known as column number 4. Many of the young men in his column come to give a great deal of respect to Che, and they become known as Los Chochoros, or Che's Cubs. Che acted as the commander, father, and older brother to many of them, teaching by example, but also giving them lessons on reading, writing, and general education. However, he was a very strict leader, often withholding food for days for even minor offenses. By October, Che had a new base in an area called La Mesa and starts to organize, creating an armory, bakery, butcher, and even a newspaper called El Cubana Librea. By February 1958, they are broadcasting messages on their own radio station. It is late that year that Che meets Elena Marsh, who has worked with the July 26 movement, smuggling weapons and messages from cities to the rebels. On one occurrence, her cover is blown and she is forced to stay with the rebels. Her and Che quickly become lovers. After 18 months in the Sierra Maestra, Fidel orders Che to take a command of his column and march to a small town outside of Santa Clara, Cuba's fourth largest, and one which was a mere 4 hours from Havana. Che used a small group of men to attack military provinces with psychological warfare. One tactic they often would use is that one man would creep up to a military base behind cover, fire a single shot, and wait for essentially the wall of fire that was to return. He would then go home and go to sleep. This would happen once, and then the next night they would send 2 men, one at 11, one at 4. The next night, the base would not be sleeping, and by the end of the week, almost in every occasion, the base was cleared out. On December 27th, 1958, Fidel Castro orders Che to take his forces into Santa Clara, which was the last bastion of Batista's forces, where Che engages a force 10 times his size. Che soldiers, however, are well-bonded, well-trained, and ready and willing to die for the cause. This in comparison to Batista's forces, which are poor soldiers who have lost the will to fight because of information about the rebellion's success, and who have no real stake in the continuation of Batista's government. The battle officially ends when more members of the July 26 movement hijack an armored train and reinforcements are delivered to the city. The surrender of the troops in Santa Clara prompted Batista to gather his top officials, several $1 million, and flee Havana. As news of Batista's surrender circled around Cuba, soldiers surrendered, and Fidel, as the rest of the July 26 movement, headed to Havana. It's interesting to note at this time that while Che was ordered to march directly on Havana and begin to seize control, Che grabbed a jeep and began taking Fidel grabbed a jeep and began taking a very long parade-like march into Havana, spanning almost the entire length of the island. As Che enters Havana, he quickly has to set more oppressive measures on these young men who, after 2 years in the mountains, are now entered into the Vegas-like society of the America's basically dirty night tourist attraction. Hilde, Che's wife, who had not seen Che in the last 2 years, immediately departs to Cuba, not aware that there's another woman. As she arrives, Che immediately tells her that he no longer loves her and wants a divorce. Che marries Elena just a few months later. Castro takes the position of Prime Minister on February 16, 1959, and at this point is not yet calling himself a Marxist. His affiliation to Che, however, calls this into question. And with the fear that Che's radical Marxism will threaten his public face, he begins to, at least superficially, distance himself from Che. He assigns Che to take over La Cabana Fortress, which is a garrison located over Havana Harbor and was used for trying war criminals and members of the past regime. Over the next 18 months, hundreds of people are executed by firing squad, which cemented Che's reputation. During this time, the Americans begin to ask, who is this new regime that has taken over? What does it mean for our interests, things like that. I found it funny that the Russians were asking the exact same thing. Nikita Khrushchev's son remembers his father thinking, who are these people? One pro-American dictator is replaced by another pro-American dictator. Whatever the case, he is certainly pro-American and possibly as agent of the CIA. He was a little bit wrong on that one. during the early months after the consolidation of power, goes to Washington and famously proclaims that he is not a Marxist, not a communist, and identifies himself as a democratic humanist. But behind the scenes, he has already allied himself with the Communist Party of Cuba, either because he had been officially convinced by Che and others close to him, or because of the opportunity for him to gather power from the Marxists of his party. In the same time, Fidel sends Che overseas to attempt to look like he was marginalizing a radical Marxist. The overseas travel, however, is important to the survival of Cuba, as Che begins a tour through Africa, Asia, and Europe, and finally makes the first contact with the Soviet Union, making them a deal that the Americans had previously rejected in buying Cuban sugar, and for the sugar, they will receive weapons, aircraft, and tanks. They also receive oil, which the oil refineries owned by the U.S. on Cuba refuse to process. When he returns, Fidel promotes Che to the head of the industrialization department and puts him as the head of Cuba's national bank, where he shows his disdain for the mercantile class by signing the currency simply Che, an immense assault to capitalists, I guess. The first seizures of land in May 1959 prompted those opposed to communist views to begin fleeing Cuba. In response, Che takes a more radical plan, in which he thought the only way for Cuba to remain sovereign from the United States was to become economically independent of them, and to sever all economic ties with the U.S. At the same time, everything was owned by the United States: electric companies, the ports, the mines, the aircraft shuttles, even the television stations. The government nationalizes all American oil industries, and within months, all American-owned companies are seized by the Cuban government. This is the last straw for the Americans, obviously, and they make plans to eliminate Castro and Che and to roll back the revolution, culminating, of course, in the Bay of Pigs invasion, which, because of the general knowledge and time restraints, I'm not even going to pretend I have enough time to go into here. The important thing to note is that Che had absolutely nothing to do with the Bay of Pigs invasion. He was stationed several miles south. However, the victory fell square in the laps of both Fidel and Che, who were seen as these strong individuals fighting American imperialism, essentially cementing them as very powerful leaders of the country. After the Bay of Pigs invasion, Che meets with a high-ranking Kennedy aide named Richard Goodwin, where the first thing Che says to him is "Thank you" for the Bay of Pigs. Castro and Che are convinced another attack of Americans are coming, and reach out once again for the Russians for support, who support them by posting missile bases in Cuba, which of course leads to another event, the Cuban Missile Crisis, that I'm not going to go into, simply for time restraints and for general knowledge of the subject. The removal of Soviet missiles, however, is viewed by Fidel and Che as a betrayal of the Soviet leaders, and Che travels to Russia to reprimand them. Afterwards, he realizes that Cuba needs more strong leftist countries to call allies, and finds this in China, where he finds the reform ideas of Mao impressive, as he sees someone else attempting to transform a poor agrarian society into a strong industrialized communist nation. From China, Che gets the idea of what he called the Socialist Man, someone who does not avoid labor but holds himself to a standard of self-sacrifice for the betterment of mankind, and returned to Cuba to instill these ideas into the citizens. He began working in many sugarcane fields on his days off, and even created a volunteer work program. In his professional life, he began working non-stop and often slept in his office, urging his comrades to follow his example. His sternness was reflected in his home as well, by refusing to let his wife use the ministry car and forcing her to return expensive gifts given to her by foreign dignitaries. It was during this time that he revitalized his dreams of extending the revolution to more Latin American countries in an attempt to give the Cuban government some breathing room against the Americans. He became to be seen, even by the Russians, as a radical who was pro-Chinese and perhaps should be marginalized. In 1964, realizing that the situation was becoming difficult and realizing that Fidel had become dependent on Russian economic help, Che becomes wary and disenchanted. In 1964, American attention is taken away from Cuba by Vietnam and Africa. Africa draws the Cuban attention as well, who see the area formerly known as the Belgian Congo as a possible heart for future revolutionary movements. and decide to lend aid to the forces fighting against the Americans. Before leaving for Africa, though, Che heads to New York to address the League of Nations, wearing the fatigues of the revolution. He attacks America for its involvement in Vietnam and in the Congo. Next, he travels to the African city, Algiers, where he openly criticizes the Soviet Union. When he returns to Havana, Fidel and Che have a closed-door meeting where after the attack on the Soviets, it is decided that Che should perhaps leave the sphere of Cuban politics. Che travels to Africa to meet with the rebel leaders, where he finds that the Congolese troops are disorganized, without strong command, and untrained. There is one meeting in particular where Che is waiting to meet with a head Congolese rebel who shows up on a speedboat with 2 prostitutes and a bottle of rum in his hands. Che's men almost immediately mutiny there upon seeing the man they're allying themselves with. Che launches a few successful raids but loses 6 of his few original men in the process, a blow to Che's ability to fight a revolution. At this time, Che is going through a very difficult time. That year, his mother had died, which affected Che deeply, and the revolution in Africa had been going poorly. Finally, Che admits defeat and flees to Prague. At this time, Fidel contacts Che and urges him to come back and resume his duties in the Cuban military, which he refuses, saying he would rather go fight more revolutions. Fidel brokers a deal with the Bolivian Communist Party for Che to travel to Bolivia and lead a revolution there. Che jumps at the chance and hopes to start a liberation war that would spark revolution all over Latin America and sap the strength and firepower of the United States. To sneak into Bolivia, Che develops a convincing disguise as a middle-aged businessman by plucking out each of his hairs one by one, donning glasses and a tweed suit, and having an identity created for him. After entering Bolivia, Che changes the plan. Instead of using Bolivia to start revolutions throughout Latin America, he decides that Bolivia will be the start of an all-encompassing revolution led by him. The Bolivian Communist Party refuses to follow this plan unless the Communist Party of Bolivia heads the operation, and Che refuses, losing support of the party. The prevention of Che's plan leaves him with a mere 24 soldiers. As Che attempts to start his campaign, he quickly finds that the supplies are limited and that the peasants support the revolution very little, because they often own land, had democratic elections, and had a free press. This lack of supplies and support did not stop Che, who reasoned that if he could do it in Cuba, he could replicate the revolution in Bolivia. Che began similarly to the Cuban Revolution by ambushing military patrols that had been sent to find and exterminate the rebel forces. After weeks of this, Che splits his group into 2 groups: the rear guard, led by a rebel leader named Joaquim, and the vanguard, which of course he leads. He also sent 2 men to deliver a message to Fidel. Unfortunately, these men are captured along their way to a city and are interrogated. The poor conditions make it very easy to bribe the 2 men with simple food, who quickly describe their leader as Che Guevara, who at the time had disappeared from the American view, most American governments thinking that he was probably dead at this point. With evidence that Che was trying to start a new guerrilla campaign in his country, Bolivia, President Barrientos began a propaganda campaign against the rebels, often claiming that any person who went out to the rebel forest would be raped and mugged by the rebels. After failures in Bolivia, including the deployment of a newly formed Green Beret from the Americans to train Bolivian Rangers with the express mission to find and capture Che, he decides that it's time to leave. He must first gather his remaining troops. It has been 4 months since Che has seen the rear guard, who stayed at base camp with the sick, and they begin to move toward the Rio Grande to meet up. The rear guard gets to the river first and is forced to ask a peasant where they should cross. Unfortunately, the peasant betrays their position to the military, and as the rear guard is crossing the river, an ambush occurs. All but 2 men of the rear guard are killed. After this, Che's campaign in Bolivia turns into a quest to survive. They begin running constantly, being chased and ambushed, having to travel in harsh jungle conditions to the point where the men begin to hallucinate and become very ill. In 1961, 11 months after entering the Bolivian mountains, Che and his men are nearing a small town to get supplies when they are ambushed again. 3 of their men are killed instantly, and Che and another man are forced to run to a ravine near a nearby farm. The farmer sees them and reports their position to the military. Hundreds of soldiers are immediately deployed to the area, and as they come down the mountain, they find themselves in a position that they have cornered Che and his men, leaving them only one choice: fight. In this battle, some of the men are killed. Che himself is wounded and his rifle is shot from his hands, becoming literally unusable. Luckily, a rebel named Willet comes to Che's aid, giving him support as they retreat. Unfortunately, they are captured a short distance away by men of the same group that had just attacked them. When asked who he was, Che said, "Hey look, I'm Che. I'm worth more alive than dead." It takes an army, but Che is finally captured. The date is October 8th. Che, using the support of Willet, marches several hours to La Guevara, a little schoolhouse that the military was able to convert into a holding cell. He's interrogated by a Bolivian officer there, who says, "Back a few weeks ago, essentially when the cause is lost, why did you not disband your group and run?" To which Che replies, "Where would I go?" I think just a stellar look at exactly what drove this person. He had nothing but the revolution at this point. A day after his capture, CIA agents question Che in La Guevara, and he refuses to answer any questions. A few hours later, Willet is executed in the holding cell separated by the school walls from Che. The American government gets back to Bolivian command as to the price of Che's capture. They get $500 for it being Che, $600 if Che is dead, and $700 if Che is alive. And it is decided that the government will be receiving $1,100 for Che's body. For them, Che is too much of a liability, and the radio is already reporting that Che has been killed in a firefight. When told that it has been decided that Che would be executed, his only response was, "It's better this way. I should never have been captured alive." Less than an hour later, a volunteer to execute Che enters the room that Che is being held in, and Che allegedly says those famous last words, "Shoot, coward, you are only going to kill a man." Che's body is transported by a helicopter to a local hospital. The military did not even put him in the helicopter. They tied him to a gurney that was airlifted away. Before taking off, a priest steps forward and gives to give Che his last rites, an irony for a man who is a well-known atheist. His body is put on display in a town called Villa Grande, and the famous picture is taken by a photographer in the town named Rene Cadillac. Che's hands are removed to be sent to Cuba as proof of his death, in the fear of Fidel claiming that it was a government plot. The next morning, he is buried in an unmarked grave with the soldiers to prevent any shrine to Che being built. The resting place was undisclosed for 28 years before the location was announced by a former general in an interview by a Che historian. His remains were gathered from the grave and put in a tomb in Santa Clara, Cuba. Che's legacy lives on as a hero and a symbol of the revolution, despite its bastardization by American capitalists. However, looking back on his life, Che would have considered himself a failure. His dream of a socialist revolutionary war raging over Latin America was never even close to realized. And he who had fought in 3 revolutionary wars, only one of which did not end in disaster. Even if, however, he considered himself a failure, for us to do so would be disingenuous to the cause. 1 out of 3 revolutions isn't bad, and his example as well as philosophy gives us a guide to follow, both for success and for which ideas to avoid for failure. I think that because of this, it is not all excessive to say that Che nearly single-handedly shaped the way modern revolution is viewed and approached today. That's it. Any questions? Less controversial topic. Hopefully.
Isn't that what you want?
That is what I want.
Do you know any details about Batista and his whole regime?
I don't. I pretty much just stick with just Che history, so sorry. Yeah.
So just to be clear, there was an active falling out between Castro and Che.
There was a point where I think they were still loyal to each other, but what I didn't mention is that Fidel promised Che that there would be generals and supplies to meet him in the Congo. Fidel promised Che that there would be generals and supplies to meet him in Bolivia. Neither of those things happened. So at some level, I think Che just felt basically betrayed by someone who he thought was an ally. Yeah, go ahead.
So in this case, do you think from your perspective that it's fair to say that Che's revolutionary struggles outside of Cuba are less necessarily communist Al-Qaeda, but more of a way of having a politically feasible way of marginalizing Che Guevara from Cuban and Soviet international politics?
I'm not really sure. Are you saying like Fidel using Che as a force outside of Cuba? Or
well, I mean, the usual characterization is Che Guevara is this revolutionary figure who is used by Castro in Cuba to spread revolution to other countries, right? That's the dominant narrative of Che.
Okay.
But it seems to me, from what you've said and what I know independently, that instead what was happening is not unlike Trotsky in the Soviet Union, is you have a leader or a figure who becomes politically uncomfortable and is then marginalized, instead of being excommunicated from Cuba, as it were, being, right, sanctified in this heroic sense so that they can then politically be marginalized.
Yeah, I would say that's exactly a fair justification to say that that's probably exactly what happened. And that might be a little almost conspiratorial on Fidel's part, but I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility. And it's probably what ended up happening, regardless of intent. All right, great.